All right, guys, we are back with another episode of Coach's Corner University. And this week we are going to be going over hypertrophy and the ins and outs of how to get jacked. And do we have any business talking about it? No, absolutely not. This is not what we do at all. We are probably the least jacked people on this call. But apparently, you don't have to be jacked to talk about hypertrophy. You can just know the science and you'll be good to go. So that's the route we're going to go. We're going to lean on the science heavily and lay off the anecdotal experience as much as humanly possible because that's just not who we are. But Paul, hypertrophy, um, thoughts?
It's fun. Yeah, I actually made a post recently about, I forget the exact comparison I made, but I believe it had something to do with people who have the physique of bubble wrap should not be discussing how to get jacked. Um, because I think, I don't know, I have a very big disdain for people who don't practice what they preach. So if you look like a tube sock filled with mashed potatoes and you're trying to explain to people how to get jacked and tan, it's probably not the best idea. But in terms of hypertrophy, we're looking at building muscle. So how do we train in order to do that in the most expeditious manner possible, while managing stressors and maintaining some degree of consistency over time? Because we don't we all know that shortcuts never work long term, and the people who are the biggest and strongest are the ones that are going to be able to do it the longest, the most consistent. um, when we're talking about the research on hypertrophy, it's actually quite interesting when it comes to the training, because hypertrophy takes place across a huge degree of rep ranges, all the way from like 3 to 30 reps. So how do we manipulate that within the training paradigm to get the most out of ourselves and our training, managing our fatigue, and being able to continually do that week after week after week?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And so thinking about it, right, where to start off with hypertrophy. And I think anytime you start off about training and talking about training, right, understanding the mechanisms of action is going to be a great way to go because if you understand the mechanisms, then you can definitely see the forest through the trees, right? So that'll allow us to fully understand and pull out what could be the more valuable of the mechanisms to understand the mechanism. So then you can think about the training to facilitate that, and then also maybe some of the supplements to facilitate that, and nutrition and all those things play a role in how big you can get. There's nobody that eats salads all day long and gets jacked, right? Like you have to eat, you have to drive that muscle protein synthesis, you have to create an anabolic environment in order for you to grow muscle. So when thinking about kind of the mechanisms that drive hypertrophy, right? You have the mechanotransductors or the first thing, and that seems to be like the main driver of hypertrophy is the mechanical tension. And if you really want to get like into the weeds about the names of the mechanotransductors and all that other stuff, which is not that important, you can go and look at a review that Brad Schoenfeld, an updated review Brad Schoenfeld had posted on mechanisms of hypertrophy, where he details the mechanotransductors that actually are the main drivers of hypertrophy. But just understand mechanical tension is the biggest driver of hypertrophy. It seems to elucidate the most amount of hypertrophy, and we'll break those things down here in a second. But then um, you have metabolite buildup, you have muscle damage. Those are going to be the other two mechanisms that can play a role in hypertrophy. Muscle damage, not as much as metabolic buildup. And metabolic buildup is, just think of it in terms of like those higher rep range, that burning sensation. Those are going to be the metabolites that build up, the lactate, the hydrogen, and all those things that comes with metabolite buildups that will elicit another training response. And that's why what Paul talked about earlier, you see such a wide range of hypertrophy reps that can build muscle, right? You have anything in the research that shows 6 to 30 reps, around 30 to 90% of your 1 rep max is kind of the threshold and the range that you want to train at in order to get a hypertrophy response, right? And if you understand that mechanical tension and metabolite buildup are the two main components to drive muscle hypertrophy, then you'll start to realize that that should be the gist of how you set up your training. That should be the gist of how you maximize the most out of your hypertrophy. And before we go into like the details of those things a little bit more, I was just at the ISSN conference over the weekend, and Mike Roberts, PhD from Auburn, presented, and he presented on muscle hypertrophy and kind of threw in some wrinkles of how to think about muscle hypertrophy based on some of the research that his lab and other labs are doing with actual muscle biopsies, right? One of the things he's kind of going over is the idea that, you know, the myofibers, they don't necessarily lay on top of each other in a straight, clean, parallel line that we tend to think about. They interact a lot, and they bind, they twist, and they form into each other. So they're not those parallel lines that are so pretty integrated in the pictures. But in terms of like hypertrophy, he was looking at they conducted a study that produced mitochondrial improvement in mitochondrial density through hypertrophy training. And he found that there could be some ability to, if we improve hypertrophy, or if we improve mitochondrial density and mitochondrial impact within the body, then that can help promote hypertrophic responses. And if you think about it, right, when you look at concurrent training and you look at the first 6 to 8 weeks, the concurrent training usually produces more muscle hypertrophy and more strength than the two by in and of themselves, right? It's just once you get past that 6 week mark is when you start to see that interference effect. And whether you want to think of it as an interference effect, I think of it more as poor fatigue management, right? Because it doesn't, like, if you can show some type of growth and strength potentiation in the first 6 to 8 weeks, if there was such thing as an interference effect, why would it not come about on week 1, right? Why wouldn't it just like proliferate like that? It's like it comes about after 6 to 8 weeks of training, which kind of lets you think like, man, maybe they're just fucking really tired from training so much, right? And then another one he went over was through some of their staining and some of the work that they're doing in these labs. I think Gwen et al. Was the one that was doing some of the staining, and the research found that you can kind of tear apart the kind of the hyperplate, like the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy that they talk about, right? The cell swelling inside. There seems to be some research showing that you can kind of tear the inside of the muscle apart to free up some space for it to continue to grow. And we see that, and it just actually got published, but Dante Trudell's talked about this for a long time, right? With that intensity stretching of the muscle.
Right? The weighted stretching.
Yeah. So that's recently just been shown within the research that Brad Schoenfeld has put out, that actually has improvements in muscle hypertrophy. But Dante is probably smiling and laughing, being like, "Yeah, I knew that in the 90s, but that's cool. You can take credit for it now."
But you knew everything.
Yeah, right. The idea that there could be some type of tearing apart to free up more room for those muscles to grow is something that he was talking about as well, which makes you start to think about ways to improve hypertrophy through beyond those two mechanisms. And then also, if that's also the case, then you can find ways to improve that through supplementation, right? And if you're trying to improve ATP and mitochondria, that can also help hypertrophy. So some things to think of, and the underlying principle of this is like, we just don't have it figured out, really. Like, we just don't know all the answers to strength training and to hypertrophy. But the things we do know for sure is that we have myofibrillar hypertrophy, and that comes from mechanical tension, and that comes from metabolite buildup for sure. And then there is some idea is that there is sarcoplasmic hypertrophy as well. And the research on that seems to be pretty good, right? So I tend to believe that that may be something that happens with people as well, and that can be trained mostly through metabolite buildup and satellite cell proliferation and splitting and reproducing of satellite cells. But yeah, mechanical tension and metabolite buildup, and anything else you want to touch on, Paul, in order like to kind of give a little bit more details on those type of things.
Well, the one the one point I want to make, and that I hope people grabbed onto, is we have all these mechanisms for hypertrophy. We know that they all elicit hypertrophy in their own way, but we really don't have the answer to what is the right recipe, right?
No.
So this is another instance where we must have a deep understanding of the underlying principles of what we're trying to accomplish, but the way we manipulate our variables within our training paradigm for the person in front of us is going to vary greatly person to person. But until we understand what's going on, we can't do that. So when we look at mechanical tension, we're going to look at, okay, likely we want to be able to use the most amount of weight possible, given whatever we're doing. We want to put tension across tissues. We want to make sure that we can be as specific with that target as we can. Obviously, there are more compound movements. Think of things like leg presses, chest presses, hack squats, where you're using multiple joints. And then we can get into more single joint movements as well. But the goal is we want to get to that RIR of 3 or less to maximize the amount of tension we put through those tissues, the amount of stress we can put ourselves under, and knowing that the heavier weights are going to do a better job of that. But if we also know that metabolite buildup is going to be another stimulator for hypertrophy, well, we're going to want to do some more high rep stuff as well. But we also know that high rep stuff, especially done within that RIR of 0 to 3, is going to be the most fatiguing. So we need to pick and choose where we put these things into our program and what sorts of modalities that we use. You'd likely be better off to do a set of 20 or 20 to 30 on a leg extension than you would on a hack squat. When you look at absolute loading, you look at the amount of tissue stress or the amount of tissue under stress within that movement. The hack squat is likely going to be more appropriate for, a 6 to 12 repetition range. Whereas you could do a set of 20 on the hack squat and it would really, really, really suck.
Yeah.
But is the juice worth the squeeze at that point for the amount of fatigue that you're going to carry forward to the rest of your rest of your workout or the rest of your week, right? So even just within that example, having a baseline understanding of what are the modalities that we would likely choose to elicit mechanical tension? What are the potential drawbacks to using certain modalities for either mechanical tension or metabolite training? Are there ways to implement both? We think of complex training or supersets or giant sets. If you're Milo Sarchev, you're doing like fucking massive giant sets of like 6-8 exercises for the same muscle group. Then you get into, okay, well, now we have like massive cell swelling. So we're taking advantage of that possible sarcolemmic hypertrophy. So there are many different ways to skin the cat here. I really like what you said about, the fact that the research is showing new ways to get big and strong, right? Mm-hmm. The new ways aren't really new either, right? You mentioned Dante Trudel, like the guy's been doing it forever, but there's a lot of, like, this is another argument for the research being behind the practical application. Dante Trudel has been doing weighted stretching for years and years with his dog crap training. He knew it worked. He just didn't have the research to support it. Now he does. Same thing happened with carb cycling. Same thing happened with, all these different nutrition protocols. But it is nice to see that, the practical application is influencing the research.
Yeah, I mean, if you're waiting on research to teach you how to get big and strong, you're never gonna get big and strong, right? You just have to go into the gym and fucking do some stuff and
just slang it,
figure it out, right? And then look who's laid the path, right? Like you have guys like Dante Trudell and Dr. Scott Stevenson who have done it in a practical, anecdotal standpoint. And they also do their research as well, right? Those are the guys that truly epitomize evidence-based training, but they don't call themselves evidence-based coaches, right? They're just coaches, right? But the people
Right.
that call themselves evidence-based coaches, those are the ones that only cite papers, but they don't ever like, they don't ever talk about any of the other guys that are doing it, that've been there and done that. So the idea is, right, how can we maximize the most amount of muscle hypertrophy and create the least amount of fatigue possible so that we're able to continue to train and can continue to progress. It's that stimulus to fatigue paradigm
Yep.
that I've done a couple lectures on within the Coach's Corner platform, but it's the
Shameless plug.
idea. Shameless, very shameless. I mean, the name of the podcast does it enough. But nonetheless, if you guys want to get into that a little bit more, we have some lectures on that. But the idea is, right, we want to find exercise that it's like find what gives you the most bang for your buck, right? And that's the idea that not all exercises are created equal, one, and then not all exercises are created equal for each person, two, right? Like I spent 45 minutes with, I'm going to butcher his name and forgive me if you listen to this, Francis, but his name's Francis, I think Holloway. I think, I don't,
And he
maybe.
mispronounced Holloway.
Well, because it's because that might not be his last name. It's not a pronunciation. It's like a misaccreditation to his last name.
Okay.
To me, that's what's coming to mind. I actually saw him over the weekend too, and I feel really bad. But I guarantee he's a busy man. He's not going to listen to me ramble on. But he came in there and he spent 45 minutes doing the anthropological stuff within checking out the joints, checking out the size of the bones, and all those things. And he's done this for 6 to 10 years, and he fully understands that based on your bone structure, certain exercises are going to work better, right? He told me because of my femur link to my torso ratio that I would probably never develop great quads by squatting. But if I was that person that always heard squats build your legs, then I would squat until, cows came home, right? And that's just not, so understanding the dynamics of like, these are the mechanisms of how we get stronger. Now we need to find the exercise or get bigger. Now we need to find the exercises that allow us to target those muscles to the full degree that we can, right? So then we have to think, what's better to build up my quads? Could it be a hack squat or could it be a squat, right? And then when you think, okay, let's say both of them build up your quads equally. Squat is going to be far more fatiguing on the body because you have to do internal stabilization. You have to require a lot more dynamics and a lot more mental focus to push through a squat. And usually when you fatigue, your legs aren't the thing that fatigues most. It's normally going to be your lower back. So that amount of fatigue is going to be very high as well. So the stimulus is high, but so is the fatigue because you're moving a lot of total load. Then you go to the hack squat, and the hack squat has a high amount of stimulus as well, but because it's externally stabilized and it doesn't require as much mental strategizing and mental acuity to get the technique down perfectly, you're most likely going to fatigue in your legs, but it's not going to create a lot of systemic fatigue throughout the entire body. It's going to create a lot of isolated fatigue within those muscles. So that may be a better exercise to choose when picking exercises. And that goes through the whole gamut of things, right? Maybe a barbell row is not as good as a chest supported row, but maybe it is for some people, right? And that's definitely something you have to think about in terms of exercise selection. And then you also have to think about, where do I feel it, right? If I get done with a set of hack squats and Paul's like, hey, where do you feel that exercise? And I'm like, I feel it in my knees. My knees ache really bad. It's like, oh man, that's not a good exercise for you, right? You're going to feel like shit the next day. And that's going to cause a problem, right? So then we have to figure out, how can we make this exercise fit that person a little bit better? Maybe we raise the hill. Maybe we do reverse bands. Maybe we do something to create less stress on the knees and then we just go from there. But that's what I think about when I think about starting to like figure out exercise selection for hypertrophy, is that stimulus to fatigue ratio, and whether or not that's a list, like it's really not pulled out through the science to show that that's that important for exercise selection. But just understanding it and have done it for over a decade, I can definitely tell you that there is some validity to it.
Mhm.
What do you think, Paul, in terms of other things to start to think about? Maybe frequency, maybe sets and volume and things like that, plus build on what I just went on, and stuff like that.
Yeah. So to build on what you started, what the other thing I would add is like bringing it back to the intent of the movement. Like, is this a movement where we're trying to elicit mechanical tension, or is this a movement that we're trying to elicit metabolic response? Right. So that's kind of, I always look at things like as a pie chart, whether it be, when we're looking at a concurrent training model of how much for each adaptation we're trying to bias the program to, or to each exercise and what the intent is versus what I'm trying to get. And, um, you know, choosing the right modality for the intent. So if I know that metabolite training on a certain exercise makes that certain exercise excessively fatiguing, that might not be a good modality to choose. And then when you look at volume, one thing that you would have had a really hard time convincing me that volume wasn't a driver of adaptation a long time ago. But because I've almost been forced to reduce my volume so much, and my training is like taken off in all aspects, I really don't think volume is a big driver. So that's why with a lot of my programs now, bare bones volume to start. And the responses from people have been amazing if we can get them to train close to or at failure, right? That's the caveat. So how many meaningful repetitions, and I really like that concept of meaningful repetitions. So if we're doing one set to failure of say 12 reps, or we're doing 3 sets of 12 in each set, and maybe you only reach failure on the last set, in that first iteration of 12 reps, you got 4 meaningful reps, your RIR 3, 2, 1, and 0. Well, in that second iteration, if you only reached failure on your last set, you got the same amount of total effective reps, but you added 2 other sets of what we call junk volume. So when you look at the volume of your training, considering only those effective repetitions is going to be a really important consideration for how much volume you actually choose to do. And if you're training for, if the intent of the exercise is mechanical tension, well, we want to reduce the amount, like those exercises are going to be very hard and they're likely going to be quite heavy. So the least amount of junk volume you can accumulate is going to be better. If we go into that, metabolite training model, again, junk volume isn't going to serve as big of a purpose. But if you're doing a set of 20 or 30 and only the last 4 count necessarily, you've accumulated, 20 reps, you've accumulated 16 additional reps leading to those 4 meaningful ones. So that is kind of the drawback of like, okay, that's likely going to dictate what modality you choose, how you arrange it within the program, like where in terms of the session you place it. And once you have a baseline for how much volume you're performing, whether you use total number of sets, whether you use total effective reps, then you can look at on a weekly basis, are the weights moving up, right? Like, are we able to progress load? If yes, change nothing. If no, maybe you need additional work, right? Or maybe the outcome measure that you're looking at is hypertrophy. Is the scale moving up? Am I looking better? Are the body parts that I'm trying to bias moving in the right direction? These are all questions that you need to be asking yourself, and that's going to dictate whether you increase volume, whether you change movements, whether you increase frequency. I'm not sold on frequency personally when it comes to hypertrophy, because frequency to me is a driver of skill, and hypertrophy movements tend not to have a large skill demand. So I would rather dig my ditch deeper than hit it multiple times a week. That's me personally. It's what I've seen with myself and most of my clients. Um,
Well, it's the idea of like your frequency should be dictated on your ability to recover and progress, right? So, say you are on a 3 on, 2 off split, right? And by the time you get back to that 3 on, you're not able to progress your lifts. Maybe you have to go to, 2 on, 2 off, 1 on, 1 off type of split, right? You may have to give
mhm.
yourself an extra day of recovery more so than anything needs to be changed within that program, right? I don't necessarily ever think that, and the research is starting to show that frequency is not as important as we once thought it was for strength and for hypertrophy. It just seems like if volume is equated, you're in a good boat, but it's a matter of recoverability and progression models and progression schemes, right? So I think that that's the most important thing. If you're not able to make progress, think about how can I recover better first before thinking about trying to add anything. And then from there, if your recovery
Yeah,
is good, then you can start adding stuff to it to progress it.
that's a big point, and I hope people caught it. Is before you try to add something, make sure you can recover from what you're doing.
Yeah.
Like if you're in a situation where say you have 4 training days in a week, and you get to that next week and you go to hit that same body part again or that same lift again, and you're not able to progress your loading, you don't need to add anything to your program. If anything, you need to take something away.
Yeah.
Like if your lifestyle and nutrition is squared away, and that should be that should be a constant variable. Sometimes it's not. Things come up in your life and it increases your fatigue and stress. But if your lifestyle variables are squared away and you're not recovered enough within a week to hit that body part again, you're doing too much.
Yeah.
What,
So I
what would
think when,
be,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, I was going to ask, like, what would be some considerations that you would make when working with a client to say, am I doing enough? And do I need to add more, or am I doing too much and I need to take away?
So one of the things I would look at is kind of how their body feels after their training, right? If they're starting to feel kind of beat up and their joints are achy, then the idea of adding any type of volume to that exercise is going to be something that I wouldn't even think of, right? Because volume is going to drive that to be even worse over time. So that's going to be something that I look at in terms of if they're able to, if their sleep isn't impaired, then that's going to be something that tells me that they're recovering. If they're overtraining or if they're starting to do too much volume, their sleep's going to be impaired. Also, their appetite, their nutrition. If their appetite starts to go, that's going to be because they're having a hard time recovering. Right. If you look at the stress literature and the stress research, Dr. Arnie Fernando does a lot of that stuff, and he presented over the weekend that when stress goes up, your ability to create muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein turnover starts to diminish, right? Which means that
Mhm.
your ability to recover from those workouts are going to be diminished as well. So we're constantly thinking about those three things. To me, those are the three biggest things: is stress, sleep, and nutrition that are going to dictate whether or not that person's doing enough volume or doing too much volume. And then on top of that, are they able to progress in load, or are they able to progress in reps each week? So say if they're doing hack squats with 3 plates for a set of 12, they get it, 12 is their failure point. They come back next week and they do a set of 13 with the same weight or a set of 14 with the same weight. To me, that's a sign of progression, and there's no reason to change anything. If they go to the gym and they hit, 2 plates for the same amount of 12 reps, or they go down in weight, then that's telling me that they're not recovering. So then I start to look at, is it the program? Is it the volume that they're doing within the program? Or is it the lifestyle factors that are contributing to that? And I don't necessarily think of the main movements as being the contributors to cause the overtraining stuff. I look at the accessories. Are we doing too much higher volume metabolite work on the isolation movements to drive some type of adaptation? How much of that is being wasted? Can we maximize that a little bit better? And then I'll start to pull away from those things. But then if they are making progress, typically I'll start to add those things as well, right? I typically find that once you get a good rhythm for those compound movements within that 1 to 3 set paradigm, those are pretty much like they just stay,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then you just start to dictate the volume on the auxiliary stuff, the isolation stuff. And that's when you start to think about, how can I push things from a metabolite buildup standpoint, right? And how can I get the most out of that exercise? So instead of doing 3 sets of 30, why not just do one giant set of, 60 reps, right? And you get, say you pick 3 tricep exercises, you do 20 on each one to failure, and then just be done with triceps, right? Instead of doing 3 sets of 30, trying to constantly chase that ceiling of failure every single time. It's like, let's just push these 3 exercises, combine them together, and get the most out of it. Because once we hit failure on one tricep exercise, we're going straight into the other one, and we're starting to get those effective reps like right off the bat again. Whereas if you're doing a complete rest and going back into that, it may take 15 sets to start getting to that threshold of your reps starting to actually count towards muscle hypertrophy, right? And the idea with that is the Henelman effect. Did I say that correctly?
I think so. That's how I say
Okay.
it.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the idea of, once you start off with lighter weight, you're not going to recruit as much muscle motor units as you want. Then as you get closer and closer to failure, or if the load was heavier to start with, you need to recruit more motor units in order for you to lift that load every single time, right? So the idea with mechanical tension and heavier weight is that as soon as you do that first rep, you're in that threshold that's recruiting all the motor units that you need to do to create adaptation. But when you're doing the higher volume, the cell swelling, that type of stuff, it takes anywhere from probably closer to 5 to 3 reps in reserve for you to start getting to those thresholds of like, this is where we're recruiting every single bit of muscle possible, right? So the more reps we can do by recruiting those things without garnering a bunch of extra volume to get there, to me,
Mm-hmm.
that's the best way to build muscle. So that means you're picking 2 to 3 compound movements, and you're focusing on mechanical tension first and foremost in your program. And if you need to bring up a weak body part, then you're going to increase the frequency possibly. And you might do that body part first in your selection, but that body part is not going to be something that's going to take away from your compound movements, right? So say I need to build up my legs, I may do leg extensions before I do my upper body training. Those leg extensions, that little bit of work, maybe 2 sets, is going to give me that extra frequency that I need for my quads and to promote protein synthesis to build muscle in there. But it's not going to take away from my ability to do compound presses, where some people, they'll say, I need to bring up my chest, so I'll do flies first and fatigue them. So that way, when I get to the actual bench press, then my chest is going to work even harder. And the research kind of shows that that's not the case, right? You're just
Mm-hmm.
creating more fatigue for the sake of fatigue, and then everything else takes a hit, right? So I always think, unless it's a weak body part, you're going to go with 2 to 3 compound movements first, and then you're going to start working on those cell swelling, metabolite buildup type exercises that are more isolation based. And you're going to end with maybe 2 to 3 exercises there. And that's just going to dictate your split, right? And it seems like 2 days a week, 1.5 to 2 days a week of training frequency seems to be like a sweet spot for people that train very, very close to failure.
One thing that I think needs to be emphasized is the fact that if you were going to pull volume, you'd pull volume from the auxiliary stuff first, the metabolite training, and because that contributes the most to DOMs, right?
Yeah,
To
the
muscle
most to
damage.
DOMs and the most to central nervous system fatigue as well.
Right, because those higher repetition ranges are more fatiguing. So that I just kind of wanted to highlight that. And I'm the same boat as you in terms of, I personally find if someone is training specifically for hypertrophy, that 1.5 to 2 times a week seems to be good. But if you're incorporating more powerlifting type training, so if you are doing your compounds like squats, benches, and deadlifts, I do find the lower end of that frequency to be more appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
simply because I truly believe it's just the cognitive capacity to do the power lifts properly, right? Like it takes a lot of mental energy to squat, bench, and deadlift, especially to do it well.
Yeah, I definitely think people don't value rest days and stress management as much as they should when it comes to the outcome of their training performance, right? If you go
Mm-hmm.
into anything fatigued, right? Any sport fatigued, you're going to underperform every single time. So why would you show up to the gym fatigued from the workout before because you think that you need to squat 3 days a week? It's like, no, what? It just doesn't make sense. You're going to start building up all these bad motor patterns because you are going to the gym in a fatigue state, right? Something has to give and you have to train smarter. If you can't get the most you can out of the sessions that you have, add in another one in there. Like this, I like all the time. It's like, I need to bring up my legs. So I'm going to add an extra leg day. It's like, so wait a minute. So so you mean to tell me that your shitty training style that you're doing now that's not producing legs that you want to have, you think by adding just another shitty day on top of that, that those legs are going to magically grow? It's like,
Yeah.
why don't you just get better at the training you're doing? Clearly the training you're doing is not working. But for some reason you think, let me just add another pile of shit to my already proliferate pile of shit. And it's like, well, the saying in powerlifting, right? You put a 2 pound pile of shit in a 1 pound bag, it's not gonna fit, right? That's just what they're doing. So it's the idea that more is gonna be better. It's like, no, let's maximize what we have, right? And to maximize what we have, when you're thinking about mechanical tension, it's like the best bodybuilders that I've come across, and it's been a few, enough to say that I've come across them and not just blown smoke up your ass. That first rep they do is fucking hard, man.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not because the weight's hard, it's because they know how to bring in every single motor unit possible to really get those moving in the right direction. And the same thing with good power lifters, right? Like I use Sean, my former training partner, as an example. If he does a single over 800, that requires so much cognitive focus, so much motor unit recruitment, that I've seen him pull 848 for a single and it moved fairly well. And then he dropped down to do some down back off work and he couldn't fucking budge 700 off the ground. Did he just magically lose 150 pounds of strength? It's like, no, but that shit takes a lot to recover from, right? So
A lifter like that for sure. I actually have two of them. One,
no.
like one of my lifters pulled 700 for a double, and then I asked him to put it on blocks and pull it for, or no, sorry, he pulled 725 for a single, and then I asked him to put 675 on blocks and hit that for a triple. Couldn't move it.
No. So if you think about that from the dynamics of strength training, right? If we're truly trying to maximize hypertrophy and taking that set to complete failure, you're just physically not going to be able to do 3 of them or 4 of them, right?
No.
That's just not possible.
And
And
if you can, you're not going to be able to do it the next week.
right, right. So it's a matter of starting off, like Paul said, with the bare minimum volume, which seems to be right around that 1 to 2 set mark per exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Get everything you can out of those. Find 2 to 3 compound movements that really target your muscles that you're trying to work. Find 2 to 3 auxiliary isolation movements to bring up some of those muscles that you may not have hit, right? So if you're doing hack squats for legs, that may be more quad than hamstring. So maybe your auxiliary lifts are going to look more like leg curls, line leg curls, seated leg curls, things like that, right? And then upper body, you know, the thing with the exercises, exercise selection is going to be very important, right? If you're bench pressing to build up your chest, that may work for some people, but it works for very few people. So you want to find ways to, one of the biggest things with hypertrophy work is the idea of internal load versus external load, right? You want to find as many exercises that's going to create external stability as possible, as opposed to requiring you to have internal stability. So if you can do a Smith machine bench press, that may elicit a greater chest hypertrophy response than a regular bench press in and of itself. mainly because you don't have to stabilize the bar. You can fully focus on trying to use your pecs to move it because you don't need to require so much stability within those movement patterns, right? So that's going to be something to think about. Exercise selection is very important for hypertrophy. And then the great thing about that is you also can pick exercises that don't fuck you up. Where powerlifting, you kind of have to squat, bench, and deadlift. Bodybuilding, you don't have to do any of that shit, man.
Yeah, that brings up a really interesting point about stability and stimulus. So as powerlifters, we get into this mentality of like, we're just going to move the weight. We're just going to move the weight through space, right? Because we work in integration. Our goal is to integrate as much musculature as possible into our movement patterns. So then we go into our assistance work and we think, all right, well, I'm going to do dumbbell incline press. Okay, sick. You can probably dumbbell incline, like myself. I dumbbell incline press like 140s for something like 11 reps.
Oh, you're so strong.
I'm making a fucking point here.
You're so strong. Everyone unmute themselves and tell Paul
how strong
he is.
Yeah.
I got a 140-pound dumbbell bench press, but I can't bench 400 in competition.
Okay, first of all,
because he's juicy.
Bench 430 in competition.
Go ahead. You're so strong. Sorry.
It's okay, man. You get distracted sometimes. It's okay. So what I'm getting at is when I did that, I didn't feel much in my pecs. It was a lot in my triceps and shoulders.
Yep.
Had I chosen an exercise more like, a machine incline press, for example, where I could actually just focus on my pecs, maybe the load wouldn't have been as high, but if the goal was to build my pecs, I would have gotten a better stimulus. So it's trying to match the exercise with the intent, the stimulus with the amount of fatigue that we're able to carry through. And that's what helps to guide your decision-making over exercise selection.
Yeah. And to build off of that just a little bit more, not to say that internally stabilized exercises don't work. They do. They have their place. Depends on the person and what you feel, right? And if you're a power lifter just trying to add hypertrophy, you have to do those exercises. So to even continue to build on exercise selection, right? If I know I need to do some type of internal stabilizing exercise, like a dumbbell bench press or like a regular bench press, that's going to be first. Then once those stabilizers are fatigued and that movement pattern's fatigued, then I can go into an externally stabilized position because I don't need to worry about stabilizing it anymore, right? And because obviously if you're a bodybuilder just chasing hypertrophy, if you only focus on external stability, yeah, it may produce the most amount of stimulus, but because you haven't developed the stability muscles and the stability things within your body, that can also lead to injury as well. So there has to be a little bit of dynamics put in there of picking exercises that work well, that do require stability and a freer range of motion to prevent injuries over time. Because if you get stuck in a fixed position, then that can cause a lot of issues. Much like in powerlifting, if you get stuck only doing squat, bench, and deadlift all the time, then that's going to be those fixed positions are going to start to cause a lot of compensation patterns. That's going to cause a lot of imbalances. So you need to look at that type of stuff. But yeah, you want to make sure that if you're going to internally stabilize, that's your first exercise. You never want to do that in a fatigue state, which I see being preached a lot in bodybuilding right now. Is like, we're going to do our heavy stuff last.
Yeah.
Because that way we're not lifting as much of a load, because the load is the dangerous thing. It's like, no, the load is not the dangerous thing. The fucking lifting in a fatigue state is a dangerous thing, right? Doing 405 for a set of 20 deadlifts is going to be more volatile to injury than doing a set of 705 for a double. I can guarantee you that. Never once have I gotten injured doing a heavy single. I've only been injured doing stupid fucking back off work when I'm already fatigued.
I was like nodding my head. I'm like, yeah. And then I'm like, no, you idiot, you've done that. I also want to say too, there is a tremendous value in hypertrophy stimulus within systemic stress, right? Axially loading yourself is a huge stimulus.
Yeah.
We're talking hormonal response, bone density, all of these things are going to be, maximized with axially loading. That's the argument for the barbell squat, right? placing yourself under axial load, you're going to increase testosterone, you're going to increase growth. Like all of these things get bumped up through axial load.
Yeah.
So if you don't perform any axial loading, I think you're missing the boat on that. That's not to say that it should be the bulk of your fatigue within a training session, but that is the argument for that. Even
Yeah.
something like a barbell incline press as your main movement for chest training, that's a lot of load that you can move in space. And then you go towards a machine, maybe the machine allows you to, you know, maybe lift a little bit more per arm, maybe, but the load isn't on your body, it's on the machine. And I think there
Yeah.
is a huge value in that.
Well, I mean, truth be told, right? Someone that has a huge bench, huge squat, and huge deadlift is gonna have a
Gonna
lot
be
of
pretty
fucking
big.
muscle on them, right? They're gonna be big human beings. So I think, you know, these concepts, we want to make sure that we articulate and be as succinct as possible within these concepts, but understanding that a lot of these could be more geared towards advanced lifters who may not need to barbell squat anymore or do any of that stuff. As a beginner, you're going to have to go through a bunch of exercises. Barbell squat should be one of them. Front squat should be one of them. Squat variations should be there in order for you to find what exercises work and to become proficient in these exercises as well. There is something to be said about building skill acquisition in movements. It's the same thing you can argue with kids, right? If you have a 5-year-old kid that plays baseball all the way until they're 18, their rate of injury is going to go through the roof, and their ability to progress, they're going to peak when they're 12 because they haven't built any other foundational movement patterns or anything like that. So if you do that with lifting, if you just find these couple exercises and that's all you stick to, and you don't have this wide variety when you're starting off, then that's going to cause some type of issues down the road, right? So if you're trying to build a skill acquisition of a squat, that may look like a squat followed by a pause squat followed by a high bar squat, right? Those mechanisms of action are very, very similar, but they're 3 different squat patterns that's going to challenge you in different ways. That's going to build that acuity and that's going to build that skill development for those exercises. And I think that's important when you're beginning as a lifter, right? You can handle more volume, you can handle more frequency, and until you actually learn how to train hard, you're going to grow because of your own stupidity, right? Like and as you get stronger, then you'll start to realize like, oh shit, what I thought was failure before, and if you even look at the research, it'll clearly back this up, was never even close to failure, right? So you're going to have to accumulate volume as a newer lifter, mainly because you don't know what the fuck failure is yet. You don't know how to go there. You don't know how to get there. And you're not that strong,
Well, and
right?
your failure point might not be dictated by mechanical tension. It might be dictated by technique.
Technique, or because you've never actually pushed yourself to know what failure is. Failure to you maybe once the weight starts getting heavy and you're like, I think this is failure, right? Remember I don't know if you remember it, but they had like back in the 60s when they can do unethical research. And one of the research things they did was they cattle prodded someone, they shot a gun by someone's ear, and they got them drunk, and they did that, and they
Oh, I
were
remember that.
yeah, and they were able to lift more weight and do more reps based on those stimuluses than they thought they could have. It's the idea of the mom who has the kid stuck under the car and she can lift it up all of a sudden, right? Those are things that, not to that extent, but those are things that you're not going to be able to tap into until you're 3 or 5 years into training and you've pushed yourself and trained yourself to do that. There's also training to failure and recruiting as many motor units as possible. That just takes time as well. So you may have to be that person that does accumulate jump volume in the very beginning, right? So as a beginner, right, you may have to incorporate more volume. You may have to incorporate more frequency. That'll allow you to find exercises that work. And then once you find those exercises where you're like, man, I'm working my back today, and I do this exercise and it hits my back every single time, mark that down as a keeper and leave that in your program. And then you just continue to work and refine and trying to find those exercises that allow you to say that, man, this is really burning my quads. This is really burning my shoulders. then you just start keeping those extra. Then you have this big pile of exercise that you know works for you. And then once you have that, then you just run them into the ground and try to get as close to failure as possible as you can on them. And I think that's one of the things as a beginner, you need to focus on the most. All this other stuff is great. You can think about it, but it's not going to get you as far as just learning how to fucking train hard.
I'm with you. I actually did this one thing with my cousin. So my cousin wanted to compete in powerlifting. She had trained a little bit here and there, but never done any type of competitive weightlifting or anything like that. And I had her doing RPE, trying to teach her about failure point and effort, and perpetually undershooting, like perpetually. So I was this is when I was still living in Tampa. So I came home for a weekend and I'm like, you're going to train with me. We're going to squat. So I set up the safeties just low enough that it was scary for her. And when she unracked the bar, I took the J hooks off and I said, you're going to squat until you miss.
Love it.
It was safe enough. Like I told him, like, if you get to the bottom, you literally can't stand up, just drop the bar, you'll be fine. She's like, okay. She was going. She's like, rep. Ended up getting 17 reps with what she previously got for 6 the week before.
Yep.
And I was like, you know that how you felt on rep 17? That's a 10. You know how you felt on rep 15? That's an 8. And she was like, oh my God.
Yeah. And she never lifted a weight again in her life.
No, she quit lifting.
Yeah, actually, that's what I thought.
No, she didn't. She actually did. She did very well in her first competition.
Nice.
She squatted over 315 at like I think she was a 165 lifter, but she weighed 155.
Oh my God, your whole family is just so strong. What great genetics you guys have. Such superior genes.
I wish I could reach through. Except you pajama wrestle, so
that's right. Watch out. I know how to choke you with your own tank top.
I think this is fucking rip.
Yeah, probably. Because I'm so strong I can rip cloth, is what you're saying. I get it.
Yep.
Yeah, I've had that happen too, where like I would have friends from school come in to train and it's like, okay, we're gonna take this set to failure, and you don't stop until I tell you to rack it. And there'd be so many times where you can just see them pausing and be like, oh, is he gonna tell me to rack it? And like, nope, we're gonna keep going. And they would get done with that set and they're like, oh, I get it now.
Hey, I missed again.
You did?
I failed again. Linear hack squat. Yep.
Nice. Yeah. And it's like, that's just that's a skill you have to learn, right? And
sure.
even in powerlifting, right? Like, because and also I'm just a slower lifter, so I have to learn how to strain. But I think because I started off doing conjugate, right, and doing those maxes all the time, that I became very good at just straining under load and realizing like, fuck, you got way more left in you. But then you get an Olympic lifter transitioning into powerlifting, and they're so used to it either goes or it doesn't. And they'll hit us like Max Aida is a prime example of this. I've watched Max squat 705 and it looked like an empty bar. And then you go to 725 and he would miss.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just right. And that's just the way you have to learn that. You have to, and Jesse would have him doing conjugate style training just so he can start building up that ability to strain. You have to learn how to strain under load. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't feel great. And the thing with hypertrophy training is that it's even harder, because once it starts to hurt, the idea is not to speed up and get rid of that pain. The idea is to fucking sit in it and make it hurt even worse, right? It's like, I can't speed up. Every rep has to look the same. So that speed that I chose in rep 1 is going to be there as I get closer to failure. And that takes your soul away.
I'm learning.
Yeah. So just to give a quick recap, guys, right? Like, if you're a beginner, you're going to need a little bit more volume. You're going to need a little bit more frequency. Take that time to try a bunch of exercises out. Find exercises that you can feel the muscle working that you're trying to work. If you do not feel the muscle working, then it's not getting the stimulus that you want it to get. That's a fact. Because I know so many people that can lift a ton of weight and their backs look like shit, because back's the hardest thing to get that muscle connection. So take some time, try to figure that out. That does not mean lift 5 pounds and until you feel your muscles contract and be like, "Ooh, I feel it there, so I'm just going to stick with that." It's like, no, figure that out. Start training as close to failure as you can. As a beginner, try to train to failure as much as you can as a beginner. And then from there, you'll start to find the exercises that elicit the responses that you want. Then you'll start to find the volume that you're able to recover from while you train to failure. That's going to take you 1 to 3 years to figure that out. Once you get past that, then all the stuff we talked about, mechanical tension, cell swelling, metabolite buildup, that's when you can start to incorporate it. That's when you can take the rest of these recommendations and put them into play. And that's going to be starting with little volume and trying to maximize that as much as you can, right? Mechanical tension, first principle of muscle hypertrophy, that should be what you focus on. After that, once you elicit that and once you get everything you can out of that, then you go into metabolite buildup and cell swelling and get everything you can out of that, then leave the gym. Then from there, you're going to think about, how can I continue to refine that? How can I continue to add exercises in that creates injury prevention along with some type of hypertrophy response so that I can train for a very, very long time? And those are kind of the basic principles to just give a quick recap on muscle hypertrophy. Anything you want to add to that, Paul?
No, that was great.
My recap or the entirety of it? Should I bow?
Just your recap.
Thank you.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah, so if you guys are interested in learning more about hypertrophy, I think we have maybe 6 or 7 videos up on nutrition for hypertrophy, and then hypertrophy training and breaking it down even further. You guys can do a 14-day free trial at coachescorneru.com. If you guys like the episode, go to iTunes, leave a review and a 5-star rating. It's under Coach's Corner. Greatly appreciate it. If you guys haven't, we just did an interview with Mike Teixeira, going over RPE, emergent strategies, and just really the idea of creative thinking and athlete-centered approach. Very good one. We have, I got a hold of John Kiley, and we're going to have him on in July. So that'll be fun to talk to him. Yep. And I'm going to try to get a bodybuilder on and maybe a powerlifter on to wrap up this strength and hypertrophy series that we have going on. So we'll see what we can do. Hope you guys enjoy this type of approach to the podcast that we're doing. We enjoy doing it. So even if you don't, we're going to stay with it and you can find another show. Paul, do you want to leave us with anything? Words of wisdom from the great Paul O'Neill. I love putting you on the spot with this. I feel like you would have something ready by now, but you never do. I love it.
I never do. Nothing. I'm empty.
Okay.
I'm like an empty vase.
The impotent Paul O'Neill has nothing to provide to
the
show.
Holy shit.
We'll catch you guys next week. Appreciate you for listening in.